Rain slid sideways against the wide windows of the downtown bookstore, not pouring, but chasing itself in gusts, the way it did when summer hadn't quite let go and autumn hadn't decided to arrive properly either. The smell of wet concrete and paper mingled in the air like a memory. Julian stood inside the shop, 23, broken spirit more than pocket, trying to look interested in the latest stack of lit FIC darlings while stealing sips from the coffee he hadn't paid for. He wasn't expecting anyone to speak to him, let alone notice him. This was his rhythm: come here after classes, avoid his roommates, pretend he still read as much as he used to. But then she walked in. And everything shifted like someone dropped a needle on a spinning record. He didn't notice her at first. That's important. She wasn't trying to be noticed, and she wouldn't have stood out in any crowd, not at first glance. No flashing smile, no heels clicking importance, no perfume trail that made heads turn. Her coat was wrinkled at the hem, shoes ordinary, hair swept into a twist that was more convenience than style. But she moved like she'd made peace with her body a long time ago, like she didn't care if anyone watched her or not. And when she looked at the poetry shelf, not the new releases, but the dog-eared older editions in the back, Julian saw it. The way her fingers lingered on a cover without pulling it off. The way her eyes narrowed slightly, calculating whether the book was worth her time or just a pretender. That's what caught him. That quiet ruthlessness. She had a scar running from the corner of her mouth to just below her chin, faint but visible if the light hit right. It made her look unfinished. Or rather, unpolished. Like life had taken something smooth and decided to give it an edge. He found himself walking toward her before he realized he'd moved, the empty paper cup still dangling from his hand like an afterthought. When she looked up and caught him staring, he didn't have the sense to look away. She blinked, not startled, more irritated, maybe, or amused. He couldn't tell. "You're either very bored or very lost," she said, not smiling. "I could be both," he said. She tilted her head, taking him into 23, maybe 24, hair slightly too long at the back, dressed in layers like he couldn't commit to one style, carrying himself like someone who had been told he was smart and hadn't yet figured out if that was a curse or a promise. "You're not here for Rilke," she said, nodding at the shelf between them. "I'm here for the coffee," he replied. "The poetry is just my cover story." That almost got a smile. Almost. "Good cover," she said. "Bad coffee," he replied. And that's how it started. They met again 2 days later. He was back with no intention of seeing her. She was back with every intention of being alone. She wore the same coat. She didn't remember his name because he hadn't told it. He remembered everything she had said, even the tone. They spoke again. It wasn't flirtation, not in the usual sense. It was curiosity with its claws in. She didn't tell him she was 42. She didn't need to. It was in the way she spoke, measured, like someone who had already said most of what needed saying in her life. He didn't mention that he was in his last year of university, floating through a media studies degree like driftwood in a stream. He asked her, on the third meeting, if she ever bought any of the books she looked at. She said no. She was a teacher, and teachers didn't get paid to read for themselves. Only for others. He asked what she taught. She said she used to teach literature at a prep school. Now she edited grant proposals for a think tank. Much less romantic, she added. "And do you miss it?" "No," she said quickly, too quickly. "Then, yes." He asked her name, and she told him, Mara. "No last name." "You?" "Julian." "No last name?" "I'll tell you if you come here again," he said. She didn't promise. But she did show up again. They kept meeting by accident. On purpose. The fifth time they spoke, they sat on the floor of the poetry section, not touching, but closer than strangers sat. He read a line from a poem aloud, not because it was good, but because it was bad. She laughed, just barely, and then shook her head. "I hate that I smiled at that," she said. "Why?" "Because I forgot I could." It was the kind of thing that leaves silence in its wake. Not awkward silence, but full silence, the kind that holds weight. Julian didn't speak. He didn't move. He just looked at her. And in that moment, Mara looked back, and the smile turned real. Not big. Not dramatic. But unguarded. It cracked through her like sunlight through a boarded-up window. That was the climax of Act 1, not a kiss, not a confession, not even a touch, just the moment someone who had shut the world out without knowing it lets it back in, for one breath, and then another. She stood first. "Don't follow me," she said, turning to go. "I won't," he replied, not moving. But the next day, she was there again. And the next time she came, she brought a book she thought he might hate, and a coffee he didn't have to steal. Julian knew what they were doing, even if they hadn't named it. He was too young to pretend innocence, too sharp to believe this was harmless, and she was far too old to mistake companionship for coincidence. They stopped pretending they came to the bookstore for the books. They stopped sitting on opposite sides of the poetry aisle. They started walking together after the shop closed, taking the long way around blocks neither of them lived on, saying too much and not enough, their words picking at scabs they hadn't shown anyone else. She asked about his studies and he told her the truth. He was floating through his final year without aim, unsure why he had chosen his major, unable to explain to anyone why everything in his life felt blurry, like a movie he was watching instead of living. He asked her why she had stopped teaching, and she paused long enough to make him think she wouldn't answer, but then she did. The headmaster had accused her of emotional involvement with a student, not romantic, not sexual, but personal in a way that threatened the control of the administration. She had advocated for him too hard, fought for an appeal after a false cheating accusation, and it didn't matter that she had been right. The boy was expelled anyway, and Mara was told it might be best for all involved if she resigned quietly. It had taken 6 years of silence before she realized she hadn't been angry about the loss of the job, only about what it revealed, how quickly respect evaporates when power is threatened. Julian said nothing to that, because what could he say? He understood disappointment, but not like that, not with years behind it. They kept walking. It wasn't just age that marked her. It was the way she refused to apologize for not trusting people anymore. He liked that. He didn't know anyone his own age who knew how to hold a boundary without turning it into a joke or a cry for help. Mara said what she meant and didn't soften it. When he teased her about being intimidating, she said, "Good. Maybe someone will finally leave me alone." When he called her beautiful, she said, "Don't say things you don't understand." And when he asked her out, really asked her, to dinner, to a place with menus and reservations and decisions that had consequences, she didn't say no. She said, "Do you understand what you're asking?" And he said, "Yes," and they both knew that wasn't true, but they went anyway. The restaurant was on the edge of the city, dimly lit, the kind of place with soft music and real tablecloths. She wore a black dress that didn't try to hide her age, and he wore a shirt he had ironed 3 times. They didn't talk much during the meal, not because there was nothing to say but because everything was happening in the space between sentences. When the waiter came with the check, he reached for it too fast and she stopped him with one look. "You don't need to prove anything," she said, folding her napkin slowly. "I'm not," he said, though he was. Outside, the air was cold enough to cut through clothes. They didn't kiss. They didn't touch. But that night, he couldn't sleep, and she didn't try. By the time the first rumor reached him, they had already seen each other 7 times outside the bookstore. Twice in her car. Once in her apartment. It wasn't serious, not yet. But it was real. He had stopped telling his friends where he went on Tuesday and Thursday nights. She had started cooking again. The rumor came like they always do, through someone trying not to say anything, which only made it worse. A girl from one of Julian's classes mentioned seeing him get into an older woman's car. She looked sophisticated, the girl had said, laughing just enough to make it clear what she meant. "Like your mom's best friend or something." He had shrugged it off, said nothing, but inside, something twisted. Not because he was ashamed, but because he knew how fast talk spreads when people don't understand something. The university wasn't big, and neither was the department. Word would get around. He didn't tell Mara. Not at first. The letter came a few days later. Not email. Not text. A letter, in an envelope, no return address, just typed words on a plain sheet of white. It said, "Does he know what this looks like?"
Does he know what it could do to him? That was it. No name. No signature. Mara showed it to him without ceremony.
She slid it across the table in her apartment while water boiled behind her. "Someone's watching," she said.
"And they don't think this is harmless."
He stared at the words for a long time.
The letter wasn't threatening.
But it was worse in some ways.
It was condescending.
It was pity dressed up as concern.
"Do you want to stop?" he asked. "Do you?" "No."
She looked at him, tired but steady. "Then we don't," she said.
But it wasn't that simple. They both knew it.
The letter had cracked something open.
Now it wasn't just between them.
Now it was real in the world, exposed to people who had never earned the right to know. That night, as they lay on her couch, not speaking, her hand on his chest, his breath slow under it, he realized that what made this different wasn't the secrecy or the thrill. It was the fact that with her, he didn't feel like a boy trying to be something. He felt like someone who had finally stopped pretending. But neither of them slept. And by morning, the rumor had found its way to one of his professors.
Julian's professor didn't mention it during class, not even afterward when students filtered out and Julian stayed behind pretending to organize his notes.
But there was a look, a long pause before the man said anything, like he was waiting to see if Julian would bring it up himself. When he didn't, the professor handed him a printout for a film analysis project, tapped the corner of it, and said, "You've got a habit of thinking you're invisible.
You're not. Be careful what you let people see."
It was a warning wrapped in plausible deniability, and Julian carried it around for the rest of the day like it weighed something. He told himself it didn't matter, but he had trouble concentrating. He went to the gym, then the library, then nowhere in particular.
He didn't text Mara until after midnight.
She called instead of replying. Her voice sounded low and calm, but he could tell she hadn't slept. He asked if she wanted to see him and she said yes, but not tonight.
She had work in the morning.
She had to think.
He said he understood.
They stayed on the phone for 43 minutes. Most of it was silence with the occasional sentence when one of them thought of something worth saying. He told her about the professor's look. She told him someone had followed her home 2 nights ago. She hadn't said anything because it might have been nothing.
But she wasn't sure anymore. "Do you think we're being stupid?" he asked.
"I think we're being watched," she answered.
He almost laughed, but didn't.
Instead, he told her he didn't care what people thought.
She said that was a nice idea and left it there.
The line stayed open for another 5 minutes before she said goodnight and hung up. 2 days passed before they saw each other again. She asked him not to meet at her apartment. He suggested the park near the university, late, after dark. She agreed. When she arrived, she wore a baseball cap and a hoodie, which made Julian smile until he realized she wasn't joking. They sat on a bench away from the main paths, her hands tucked into the sleeves of her jacket, his legs stretched out in front of him.
"You look like you're hiding," he said.
"I am," she replied.
He didn't push it. He knew better now.
There was something about the night that made her honest, like it stripped away whatever guarded reflex she carried during the day. She told him about her father, who had died when she was 19. She told him about her first serious relationship, a man 10 years older who had left her for someone younger and never told her why. She told him she had always been good at beginnings but terrible at keeping things together once they stopped being exciting.
"I'm not here for excitement," Julian said.
"Then what are you here for?"
He didn't answer, not directly.
Instead, he asked her why she had let this start if she knew it would be complicated. "I didn't let it start," she said.
"It started. And I didn't stop it."
They sat in silence again, broken only by the sound of a car in the distance, someone's music playing faintly through a rolled-down window. When he reached for her hand, she let him take it. Her fingers were cold and still.
"We're not doing anything wrong," he said.
"That doesn't matter," she said. He turned to face her, leaning in until she had to look at him.
"Then what does?" She didn't answer that either.
They stayed like that until the air got colder and her body began to shiver, just slightly. He walked her back to her car without speaking. She didn't kiss him goodbye. But she didn't tell him to stop calling, either. The next week was quiet. No new notes. No comments. The professor stopped watching him. The girl from his class found someone else to whisper about. The air settled again, but it was uneasy, like it could shift without warning. Mara didn't invite him over that week, but she answered his texts, kept the calls short, sent him articles she thought he'd like. It was enough to keep the thread taut, but not enough to feel like it hadn't frayed. Then, on a Thursday night, they broke the pattern. He called her late, past 1 in the morning. He didn't expect her to answer. But she did. Her voice was tired and flat, and before he could say anything, she asked, "Do you want to come over?" He said yes without thinking. Her apartment was dark when he arrived. She let him in without a word. The television was on but muted, some documentary playing without sound. She poured him a drink, poured herself one too. They didn't sit far apart. They didn't pretend to watch the screen. She took his hand, not like someone reaching for comfort, but like someone deciding something. He stayed the night. There was no dramatic moment, no lines spoken to seal anything. There was closeness. There was breath. There was understanding that this had moved somewhere it couldn't come back from. And there was a shadow on the edge of the window that neither of them saw. The next morning, as he was leaving her building through the side entrance, someone across the street paused. A neighbor. A student. Someone familiar but unimportant until now. Their eyes met. The person looked away too fast, too deliberately. Julian didn't say a word. He just kept walking. Later that afternoon, he told Mara. Her response was immediate. "Then it's done," she said. "No," he said. "Yes," she repeated. They stared at each other, even through the phone. And neither of them hung up. Julian's best friend found out 2 days after the sighting. It wasn't intentional. They were on campus, sitting in the back row of a packed lecture hall, pretending to pay attention while scrolling through their phones, and Julian should have known something was off by the way Marcus kept glancing at him without saying anything. Halfway through the session, Marcus leaned over, his voice low and neutral. "Is it true?" he asked, not even specifying what. Julian didn't ask what he meant. He just said, "Yes," and then turned his screen off. Marcus stared at him a long time, not judging, not shocked, just trying to figure out what to do with the answer. After a pause, he asked, "How old is she?" And when Julian told him, Marcus blinked twice, let out a long breath, and sat back in his chair. That was it. No shouting, no lecture, just the weight of something heavy settling into the space between them. Julian didn't say more. He wasn't going to defend it. He didn't feel like he should have to. Later, after class, Marcus asked the only question that mattered, "Is she using you?" Julian looked at him hard, then shook his head. "No. She's protecting me," he said. From what, Marcus didn't ask. Maybe because he already understood. That weekend, there was a department mixer for graduating seniors, held at an upscale rooftop venue downtown. Julian hadn't planned to go, but his advisor insisted. It was the kind of event where people wore collared shirts and said they were excited for the future even though most of them had no idea what was coming. There was free wine and small plates, professors hovering at the edges, students trying to network without looking like they were. Julian showed up late, stayed near the bar, and kept his phone close. He didn't expect Mara to come. She didn't belong in that setting. But halfway through the evening, as he was talking to one of the guest lecturers, he caught a glimpse of her across the room. She was speaking to his department head. She wasn't dressed to blend in. She wore a long gray coat over a black dress, her hair pulled back sharply, not soft, not friendly. She didn't smile when people looked at her. She stood like someone who didn't need anyone's approval. Julian felt his pulse tighten. He didn't know she was coming. He didn't even know she had been invited. But there she was, and now she wasn't invisible. He moved toward her slowly, careful not to draw attention, but it was too late. One of his classmates spotted her, then him, and the look on their face said everything. He was walking into a fire that was already lit. "Mara," he said when he reached her. She looked at him with no expression, just steady eyes that told him not to lose his footing. "I was invited," she said before he could ask.
"By who?"
"The chair," she answered. "I used to work with her husband."
Small world. Julian wanted to laugh, but he couldn't.
Instead, he looked around the room and realized how many people were now watching them. Not openly, not rudely, but with that quiet tilt of attention people use when they think something interesting is about to happen.
"Should I leave?" she asked.
"No," he said.
And then she did something he didn't expect.
She took his hand. Not a secret touch. Not a hidden gesture under a table. She took his hand in front of everyone and held it like it meant something, and Julian, after one long second, held hers back. The room didn't freeze. There were no gasps. But the air shifted.
Conversations stumbled. Heads turned.
It was small, but it was enough.
Julian's advisor walked past, caught his eye, and said nothing.
One of his classmates whispered to another. The woman Mara had been speaking to earlier gave them a look that wasn't cold, just surprised. They didn't speak for a long time. They stood near the window, watching the skyline. The music continued. The party moved on without them. But something had cracked open, and now it couldn't be closed.
"Was this a good idea?" Julian asked quietly.
"No," she said. "But it was the right one." After a while, she let go of his hand and walked to the bar. He watched her move through the crowd.
People looked at her differently now.
Not just as someone older, but as someone who had stepped outside the unspoken rules and didn't flinch. Later that night, back at her apartment, neither of them spoke about what had happened. They sat in silence again, the kind that no longer felt heavy, just full. She looked tired. Not regretful, not afraid. Just tired. "I think we should stop hiding," he said. "We're not hiding," she replied. "We're surviving." He didn't know how to argue with that. But something had changed. The truth was no longer theirs alone. Now, they had to live with what came next. Julian didn't expect things to unravel as quietly as they did. There was no confrontation, no meeting behind closed doors, no formal reprimand from the university. But people began treating him differently. Some of his professors avoided eye contact when he spoke in class, as if acknowledging him would imply agreement. His peers pulled away in subtle ways, not out of cruelty but discomfort. He was left out of group chats, excluded from a team project he was originally assigned to, and when he asked about it, the professor said something vague about balancing the dynamics. He stopped pushing after that. He saw how fragile their tolerance had been. Mara handled it differently. She didn't flinch when people stared at them in public. She didn't explain herself when an old colleague sent her a text that simply read, "You disappoint me." She deleted the message and blocked the number. She told Julian she didn't care what people thought. He believed her. But he also saw the way she hesitated before unlocking her office door each morning. He noticed how she double-checked the locks at night. She had been alone for a long time before him, and alone had been safe. This wasn't. The silence between them became more frequent. Not hostile, not full of resentment, just slow. As if every sentence now had to pass through a filter they hadn't needed before. Conversations about the future turned vague. Julian stopped asking what she wanted. She stopped telling him where she'd been. They still touched. They still slept in the same bed. But the edges between them weren't as clear anymore. Something had shifted, not because they didn't want each other, but because the cost was becoming visible. A week before graduation, Julian was invited to a dinner hosted by one of the department chairs. It was supposed to be a casual evening for the top students, a thank you for good work, a chance to say goodbye. He didn't want to go. Mara told him he should. "You're not doing anything wrong by showing up," she said. "It'll be weird."
Let it be weird. He went. She didn't.
At the dinner, the tone was polite but clipped. One professor asked about his post-graduation plans. Another made a quiet remark about emotional entanglements that had nothing to do with his coursework but was said loud enough for the entire table to hear.
He didn't respond.
He finished his food, thanked the host, and left early. When he returned to her apartment, he stood in the doorway for a long time before speaking.
"I think I'm in love with you," he said. She was standing in the kitchen. She didn't move. "I know," she said. He waited for something else. She didn't give it. "Do you love me?"
She nodded once, slowly, without meeting his eyes.
"Then say it."
She turned around, faced him directly, and said it in a tone that left no room for doubt.
"Yes. I love you." He stepped forward. She didn't. "But I don't think we can keep doing this," she said. He asked her what that meant.
She said she didn't want to lie, and she didn't want to ask him to lie either.
She said she didn't want to be a lesson or a mistake or a phase.
She said she didn't want to watch him become someone else in order to stay with her.
He told her that wasn't happening.
She said, "It will." They argued for the first time that night. Not with shouting, but with sentences that didn't know where to land. He told her she was running away. She told him he was pretending the world didn't exist. He told her he could handle it. She told him he shouldn't have to. When it was over, they didn't touch. They didn't speak. He left in the morning without brushing his teeth. She didn't ask him to stay. They didn't see each other again for 8 weeks. He spent the summer working at a non-profit out of state, surrounded by strangers who didn't know anything about him.
He didn't tell them. He kept busy.
He responded to Mara's messages, short ones, just updates, just checking in.
She never sent anything emotional. She never asked him to come back.
But she never stopped replying either. In August, he returned to the city to pack his things.
He didn't tell her he was back. She didn't ask.
Then, the night before he left for good, he walked past the bookstore where they had first met. It was closed, the windows dark. He stared at the door for a long time before walking away. The next morning, there was a knock at the door of the apartment he hadn't lived in for months.
Mara stood there. No coat. No disguise.
She looked tired, but not weak. "I thought you should hear it again," she said.
"What?" "That I loved you. That I still do." He didn't ask why she came. He didn't ask what she wanted. He let her in. They didn't talk much. They didn't make promises.
There were no speeches or guarantees. Just a quiet hour in a room filled with the things he hadn't packed yet. She sat on the edge of the bed. He stood near the window. Before she left, she turned and asked him something.
"Do you think people like us are allowed to have something good?" He didn't answer. He didn't know how to. She nodded like that was enough.
Then she walked out.
He never saw her again. Or maybe he did.